Welcome to our World Water Week session on rights to water and food in freshwater resource allocation. My name is Inge Jacobs-Mata. I am the regional representative for the International Water Management Institute Southern Africa offices. And on behalf of our partners, IMI, the Water Research Commission, the Water Integrity Network, Environmental Law Institute, FAO, Rural Water Supply Network, and Wise Futures Center, we very much welcome you to this session. It's been a discussion that we've been having an evolving work with our partners over some years. And so we'd like to share with you today some of the outcomes of our research, but also policy dialogue on water tenure for equity, integrity, and redistributive justice. We also hope to share and demonstrate some innovative approaches, some practical tools for responsible governance of water tenure. And then, most importantly, with you, discuss how we can build on the growing country commitment at the moment. You'll hear from our speakers. There's a lot of momentum at the moment. Countries really committing to acknowledging customary water tenure, or hybrid water law, as some of us like to call it, into statutory water law. And we want to, with you, discuss how we can leverage that. And then lastly, set out a way forward to really forge consensus on how to address this, both in the research, but policy as well as in practice. You will hear from our very esteemed lineup of speakers today. We have Dr. Rachel McDonnell, IMI's Deputy Director General. We've got Dr. Jennifer Mulwantwa, the CEO of the Water Research Commission in South Africa. Also Barbara Schreiner, Executive Director for the Water Integrity Network, online with us. We have Mr. Jip Hoogeveen. I hope I said that right, Jip. My Afrikaans accent sometimes moves it a little bit to South Africa, but Chief Technical Advisor of the FAO. We also have Jessica Truel, Senior Attorney Director for the International Water Program at the Environmental Law Institute. We've got Dr. Aileen Okello, Global Network Manager at the Rural Water Supply Network, and then also Dr. Hans Kommerketsch, Director of Wise Futures. So you can see really experienced panel that will share very short lightning presentations, and then we will have a panel discussion that we hope you will participate in. So I will very shortly introduce our first speaker. I won't go through it. It's just to say we have a series of very short, sharp presentations, and I will be strict with the speakers. But thereafter, we will have a panel discussion where we can delve into things a little bit more. So then, without any further ado now, I'm going to play our first video recording, which is by our colleague, Barbara Schreiner, from the Water Integrity Network.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak a little bit about this very important issue. If you think back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic, which seems a very long time ago, we had great hopes that we could use the crisis as some kind of turning point, that we would be able to build back better after COVID, building a more sustainable and more equitable world. The reality, however, is that millions have actually been pushed back into poverty. According to the World Bank, the global poverty rate has increased from 7.8% to 9.1%. Globally, we have lost 3 to 4 years of progress towards ending extreme poverty. And the impacts of the COVID pandemic have been exacerbated by climate change. The World Bank estimates that unchecked, climate change will push up to about 130 million people into poverty over the next 10 years and could cause up to 200 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050. And let us be very clear, the climate crisis is deeply unjust. The poorest people in the world who have contributed the least to climate change are being hit the hardest. It's within this context that we're talking about water tenure and redistributive justice in water allocation. The combination of economic development, rising standards of living, and climate change are driving increased competition over water resources. This brings into sharp focus the issue of water tenure systems and the social and administrative justice of such systems. Across most of the world, permit systems of one form or another are used to allocate water between water users and are often held up as the gold standard for water allocation. Most permit systems require that above a relatively small volume, water users must apply for a permit to use water. On paper, these systems seem logical and administratively sound. When one steps off the paper and into the real world in developing countries, however, the reality is very different. What we find in reality is limited government capacity to implement permit systems over large numbers of small farmers spread over vast areas of territory. We find that many of these small users don't even know that they're supposed to get a water permit. We find that many of these small users obtain and use their water under customary living law, which is often not recognized by statutory law or, in some countries, is recognized in land and forest law rather than in the water law. We find a system that is deeply discriminatory, not by design, but in implementation or the lack thereof. If we take a step back then and relook at what is on paper, we have to recognize that in many cases it's actually bad law, on the assumption that law that does not address the reality, law that can't be implemented, is bad law. And let's not pretend that we're easily going to build the capacity to implement permit systems as they're currently devised. I've been in the sector for going on 3 decades and I haven't seen that happen yet. We need to recognize that water tenure is fundamentally a political economy question, not a technical issue. The underlying question is who should have access to how much water and for what purposes, and what is the role of the state in allocating water, and in particular in addressing the power imbalances between water users, between, for example, Coca-Cola or Nestle or any other big multinational, and Mrs. Mkhwanazi, who irrigates 2 hectares to make money and grow food for her family. And following from that question comes the question, what is an appropriate system of water tenure to protect Mrs. Mkhwanazi's water rights? If we want to build that better world that so many of us hoped for at the start of the pandemic, we have to address social justice issues in the water sector. Social justice is about advocating for equal economic, social and political opportunity for all, including women, children, the poor and members of racial, ethnic or religious minorities. Social justice requires a redistributive approach to water allocation that supports, for example, SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, and SDG 10, reduced inequalities. Currently, most countries around the world subscribe to the human right to water. This right is fundamental and should be delivered and protected by the state as a universal right covering everyone. And yet we also need to recognize that the human right to water as currently defined is an absolutely critical minimum. It does not take into account the water needed for economic activities at the household level or for the growing of food in rural areas. In other words, it is the bottom rung of a ladder of water needs. Water tenure systems are a fundamental part of building a more just and equitable society. Administrative justice is a cornerstone of water justice. It provides a means of holding the state to account, particularly when the effectiveness of traditional legal and political accountability methods are questioned. Accountability is a critical element in a fair water tenure system. Water users, small and large, should have the ability to hold the state accountable for the allocation of water and for the protection of their water rights. This is clearly not possible for those water users who don't even know that a water allocation system exists outside their local customary practices. Without an appropriate interface between customary and statutory systems, the accountability chain is broken. Without data on water use, including water use by small irrigators, the accountability chain is broken. So if we are going to take on board the challenge of socially just allocation of water in the face of the climate crisis and in the face of increasing competition for water, we need to develop water tenure systems that work in practice and work to protect the rights of the most marginalized, are adaptable to changing circumstances while continuing to protect the rights of the most marginalized, are decolonized, and take on board the practices of customary living law in equal value with statutory law, are transparent, equitable, and administratively just. There is much that can and is being done in developing and implementing appropriate water tenure systems. Besides decolonizing and recognizing living customary tenure, we need to build the awareness of the critical importance of appropriate water tenure systems. Develop, for example, hybrid water law systems that target permits with due process to the minority of high-impact users while developing appropriate systems to manage the huge number of small users at the other end of the scale, either through customary law, prioritization of their water use, or other innovations that we haven't yet seen. I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations and discussion in this session about how we can move forwards towards understanding what is needed to achieve this and to building fair water tenure systems that protect the rights in particular of the poor and the marginalised. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Barbara. Now, Barbara, well, this was a pre-recorded video. Barbara is online, and she will be participating in the panel discussion. Barbara really set the scene for this session today, talking about how do we define customary water tenure. And for those who are new to this field, it's really those traditional, informal ways of managing water that communities have used for, centuries. And this work, this body of work with our partners is about how we embed this into statutory water law. Now, we know that it's not always as easy, that there are some challenges in the operationalization of customary water tenure. And through one of the projects that has been funded by the Water Research Commission, we looked at just this. We looked at how can you operationalize, implement customary water tenure in a catchment. And while she is now the CEO of the Water Research Commission, at the time, she was actually our implementing partner as the executive for water resource management at the Inkomati Usutu Catchment Management Agency, which is one of those CMAs, catchment management agencies in South Africa. And we worked with the IUCMA to look at what are these challenges. So I'm going to now ask Dr. Jennifer Mulwantwa to come and just briefly introduce this project, both now as a funder, but also as the implementing agent of this work. So Jennifer, thank you, and over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Indeed, Inga, I think given the time limitation, we will just set the scene in terms of what are the current practices and what is proposed as the findings of this study. So as I'm hoping that you can all see, the project was in collaboration with the Inkomati Usutu Catchment Management Agency, which is a localized water authority, water resource management authority, the Department of Water and Sanitation, Environmental Law Institute, VETS, and other partners. But in essence, what has been indicated here is that we've got this this pyramid kind of approach when we are talking about water rights and water allocation, wherein the majority of the people are actually limited to very low volumes, and because there is no right and there is no access to water. But as you go down the inverted pyramid, you will see that the majority of the water is allowable for industry and agriculture, and that is as a result of the instruments that are available in law to ensure that there is a right to access of the majority of the water. So this leaves a lot of the people, as Barbara has indicated, particularly those that were historically disadvantaged by staying in areas that we called homelands, that really had no right and continues not to have a right, because the lands are actually held in trust on behalf of the people by the chiefs. So you would never find a situation where one has a title deed or one has got the ability to apply, but also it is so cumbersome, and the requirements to apply for a license, for example, that then it limits these people, and all they are able to do is to really just depend on just the limited volumes that are available. In many times you find that the water resource will pass by the local community and the people will not utilize it because they do not understand, or in some cases will utilize it, pollute, and even not understanding what is their rights and what are their limitations. Thus, the study looked at the different approaches that needed to be taken in order to ensure that the picture is changed from that of a pyramid but to that of equity, where all that utilize the water have got the right to access the water, have got the ability, but there are no limitations as well as obstacles, particularly when we're looking at the most vulnerable and the people that are living in the rural areas. Therefore, the study looked at a number of proposals that have been made in that we need to redefine the basic human needs reserve, which is the only right that exists within our water law and under the Constitution. And therefore, we need to extend the right for human health requirements from just the 25 liters per person per day, but also we need to ensure that it includes multiple basic needs. Therefore, it would come as part of the law, as part of your existence when you live in these areas, that you do have that right and you do not have to go through a process of application. Secondly, we can look at utilizing the currently existing instruments such as the National Water Act in terms of your general authorizations and your reserve to be able to recognize customary water tenure. What we mean by that is you do not have to apply. We are extending the volume of water to cover and be inclusive. Currently, we have one system instrument that we use called general authorizations, and these you don't have to apply. You just get a confirmation that the use that you are applying for, it falls within that. And that is where we are also saying this would be a very helpful situation for people that need the customary water tenure. But thirdly, is to not only pay lip service, but really give tenure priority after the reserve and international obligations in terms of the rights and the priorities within the national water strategy. What the third right, the third priority is around the improvement of livelihoods as well as poverty eradication. And when we quantify these volumes to be effective and in line with what customary tenure requires, then there will be no requirement for applications and it will also come simplified. Fourthly, it's to ensure that there is equity in sharing of collectively held customary rights. And this means that you could have the community deciding what do they do with their collective volume that they have. If they intend to do development, if they intend to go into commercialization, they would be able to do that. In fact, it is one of the rights and still the rights that are being enjoyed by the previously advantaged because of the fact that they are still falling within what we used to call, or what we still call, the irrigation districts. But lastly is to ensure that the strict licensing requirements for the high impact users, it's only limited to that. For those multinationals, for high impact, and they will then have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that what they require is efficient, is effective, there's socio-economic benefit for the people. And also the customary water tenure holders, they would have to be consulted, because in many cases, we also say that there needs to be consultation, but the people are not actually central to this process. And we believe that through this process, people will be, earn their dignity and will start understanding that they have a right, and we can be able to push a policy direction in this regard when the authorities get to understand more about this. And I think most importantly and lastly, it's around social education and awareness, not only for the people, but across the ladder, because even at the level of decision making, the customary water tenure is not understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. I just want to go back to this little picture here, which I think is so important also for our discussion, which is our prioritization. When we started this work, we looked at, as Jennifer said, several legal instruments, existing lawful use. We looked at the permitting or licensing system. We looked at different schedules, categories, infinitely more challenging to change. But a very simple but highly impactful way to achieve this already exists in our legal framework, in our policy framework. In South Africa, it's called the National Water Resource Strategy 3, which already sets out a priority list, priority users. And this is something we'd be interested also to hear those of you who work in this field of prioritization, because there it's quite easily, it's quite explicit that the third priority is poverty eradication, improved livelihoods, and greater racial and gender equity. But how operationally, how to implement that, that is the question. But so I just thought I'd leave that with you. It's a really fundamental point to our discussion today. So thanks so much for that, Jennifer. Now we want to move on to our next speaker, Jip Hogeveen from the FAO, who will now provide a much larger global picture, moving from a country case study now to a larger picture, also talking about the country commitments and where we are. So, Jip, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much. So, good afternoon. In this presentation, I would like to give you a quick introduction. Yeah, okay. Yeah, let me a little bit. Quick introduction on what are FAO's future plans on the water tenure agenda. Over the last 3 years, we have been implementing the Know What project, and Know What that stands for knowing water better, and it is a project that tries to link the biophysical aspects of water use, different type of users, including mainly agriculture, with water tenure. In this project we have had very interesting results, but eventually we would like it to get also into the voluntary guidelines for the tenure of natural resources. Unfortunately, we are still very far from that. The voluntary guidelines on the tenure of natural resources include the tenure on land, on fisheries, and on forestries, but not on water. So what we try to do now is we call upon a global dialogue on water tenure to get the concepts of water tenure a little bit better across. But first, a little bit on the Know What project. The project was designed as a bottom-up project, and it works in 3 different countries that you see over here: Senegal, Rwanda, and Sri Lanka. The Know What project has been instrumental to understand better the concepts and the debate of water tenure. It has contributed to our understanding, and the outcomes we have been working on assessments of water tenure in those 3 countries, and we have done a lot of work on the advocacy and outreach to put water tenure on the international agenda. So all these inputs they form a strong base for a global dialogue on water tenure. So now comes the good news. So on the 19th of July, FAO's Committee on Agriculture that passed a resolution in which it calls upon its members to actively engage on a global dialogue on water tenure. And this is indeed very good news because the COAC is one of the statutory bodies of FAO that guide our work. So if the COAC members they say that we have to work on water tenure, that means that we have to do it, and we will have to report on it also. So what can we do with such a global discussion on water tenure? So it is still clear that from the discussions that the understanding of the concepts of water tenure, there is still room for interpretation. So we still have to work on that. So I think we all agree that water tenure arrangements are a prerequisite for countries to improve their water governance in order to adapt to climate change, for example. And I think that through a global dialogue we could strengthen these capacities. Of course, next to climate change, we should also look at other issues. Population growth is still an important drive for water scarcity. So we should be very mindful that water rights of vulnerable populations, including indigenous people, are included, and of course also strengthening, safeguarding the water for the environment. So now, how could this process be structured? First of all, we think about local assessments of country dialogues on water tenure, and then more than the 3 countries that we have already done. That, in addition, we should go to a higher level and regional consultations, and that means then on a subcontinental scale with multi-actor participation, governance and civil society, academia, private sector and international organizations will then be invited, and that then should move towards the global activities to facilitate on advocacy and outreach. Eventually, we also hope that that we can come to technical guidelines, and then the ultimate objective will then be that there will become endorsements of those guiding principles at the international fora, like, for example, the Committee of Food Security. So what is FAO to offer? First of all, well, we know about agriculture and we know about water use in agriculture, so that's a good thing. Then there is a knowledge between what happens now? Did I do something? No? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So furthermore, there is a strong link between water for agriculture and food security, and it's very important to strengthen the link between water accounting and water governance. So you need to know also very much how much water is available before you can make sure that people have the right to water. SFAO has also, we have a strong base at country, regional and global levels, of course, and we have an experience in these type of processes, which is specifically known for our work on the voluntary guidelines on governance on tenure of natural resources. So now the next step. So the first next step that we are going to do is the first expert consultation, and that will be held on from the 8th and the 9th of November. And and we have to finalize our project of the No Water project. We hope that you all will engage in this global dialogue. So I would like to invite you to check regularly the website and see how you can engage in the dialogues with countries and with all our partners. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks so much. And I think this is a really welcome development to grow this community of practice and build the momentum of country commitments. We had a chat yesterday, just some of the partners also needing to think about the capacity. So while there are some governments that are progressive now, taking on, really trying to integrate and acknowledge customary water tenure, how exactly to do that and the capacity to do that, which legal instruments to target. This is also a key aspect that we hope would be addressed in these in the global dialogue. So no pressure here, but just a slight mention there. Thanks. Let us now move on to 2 other case studies, country case studies, as well as a sectoral case study. I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker. It is a video recording, but she's also online, Dr. Aileen Okello from the Rural Water Supply Network, who is talking about how we connect tenure issues as it exists within WASH, and now moving that into, or connecting it rather, with water resource management. So here we go. It is a recorded message.
Good day to all. My name is Aline Saraiva-Okello, and I work for the Secretariat of the Rural Water Supply Network, which is hosted by SCAT Foundation in Switzerland. I am a civil engineer and a water resources specialist by training, and I'm Mozambican, but currently based in Kenya. And I lived for 10 years in South Africa. So you can say I'm a truly African citizen. I did my master's and PhD studies at IHE Delft in the Netherlands, and my PhD actually focused on the hydrology and water resources management of the Nkomati River Basin. I'll be talking to you today on the human right to water and food, integrating water, sanitation, and hygiene in water resources management. First, let me take you back to the Nkomati Basin where I did my PhD research. This is a transboundary basin shared by Mozambique, Swaziland, and South Africa. It's mostly located in a semi-arid climate with 700 millimeters of rainfall and high evaporation and limited runoff. This is a hard-working basin with nearly 50% of water allocations used for irrigation, as you can see on the right side of the panel. 30% is used by forestry, commercial plantations of pine and eucalyptus, and 15% used for interbasin transfers, and just 5% for domestic and municipal water use. However, the forestry and agricultural sectors are located mostly upstream in the catchment, which means they take up the water first. Being a Mozambican, I've often heard complaints in my side of the basin that during the dry season there's not enough water in the river downstream, which affects livelihoods of poor smallholder farmers, fishermen, and the environment. So in the midst of these competing water uses, how do we manage the water resource? Well, I've learned that the solution is not just a technical one. It's not just about building more dams or more storage infrastructure. Rather, more comprehensive systems understanding, transparency, collaboration, consultation is required to ensure that basic human and environmental needs are met. Now, getting back to my current hat at the Rural Water Supply Network, we have seen a lot of discussions about service delivery models, technology, sustainability of water services, and others. As most of you are familiar, since 2010, water and sanitation were declared a human right. States are encouraged to provide financial resources and help capacity building and technology transfer to enable provision of safe, clean, accessible, and affordable drinking water and sanitation for all. This is also confirmed on the SDG 6. This has changed perspectives. People now have rights to these services, and governments are responsible for realizing these rights. In practice, however, this task usually falls to the local government. But there are challenges. Especially in developing countries, there is a lack of resources, lack of capacity, political interference, competing priorities, lack of clarity in roles and responsibilities between different institutions. So how can we ensure that human right to water and sanitation is fulfilled as per SDG 6? Currently, 80% of people without access to safe water and sanitation live in rural areas. And we must remember that water for domestic uses, agriculture, food production, industry, forestry, all comes from the same resource pool. So it's important to have an holistic view of the system and involve all stakeholders, including marginalized groups, in water resources planning, allocation, and management. Smallholder farmers, women, people with disability, pastoralists, and nomadic groups are often left behind when out of the decision-making tables, which means they get left behind in the access to safe water. And remember, it's not just about quantity of water, but the quality needs to be adequate as well. Considering the huge variability in water resource due to land uses, seasonality, climate change, it is critical to learn and respect practices of communities and work with them to implement more sustainable solutions. At RWSN, we hosted a few webinars on pastoralist water rights, human rights to water. And from a WASH perspective, it's important to do proper siting and location of water sources in consultation with communities. And we understand that rural communities have strong resource governance systems that should form the basis of water management. We should consider the interests of the different groups and design and implement infrastructure with provisions for domestic and productive and livestock use. I look forward to discuss more with you during the session, and I invite you to join RWSN and check out our resources for more information on the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Eileen. Eileen is also online for the panel discussion, but really highlighting this issue of water for multiple uses, and both, the quality as well as the quantity dimension into the debate. Our next speaker will similarly present a case study, now another case study moving more into East Africa. And this is Dr. Hans Komakec from the Wise Futures Center at the Nelson Mandela Institute of Science and Technology. So without any further ado, let me load that presentation.
Hello, my name is Hans Komakec, and I will be presenting to you about living customary water tenure in the Pangani, Tanzania. Pangani Basin is located in the northeastern part of Tanzania, and the main water source is Kilimanjaro and Mount Meru. It covers an area about 43,650 square kilometers, with about 5% of that in Kenya. The basin has 3 hydropower plants which are located downstream, and about 4 million population who are dependent on agriculture, irrigated agriculture for their livelihood. In the Pangani basin, farmers have constructed irrigation infrastructure, and the water tenure is characterized by local investment in water infrastructure and distribution rules. As you can see from here, some of the infrastructure that are constructed either for storage or conveying water to farms. I consider this a living process where water flows are connected with the material artifacts and local ideals, but also formal structures. For instance, state-led water use associations are often integrated with the institutions or arrangements that have emerged and evolved over time. The nature of the water tenure, especially around irrigation, we have the farmers have developed flexible allocation rules or schedules or abstraction terms. The allocation rules are renegotiated on a seasonal basis with the area served by irrigation canal, and also among intakes and along the river canal. Thus, the irrigated area may expand and contract with sink depending on water availability, especially during dry period. The river water may be reserved for domestic and livestock use only. Similar arrangement, of course, have been observed in other parts of Tanzania. Now, for this particular case of today, I'm going to talk to you about one area, specifically Makanya catchment, which is a relatively dry catchment within the Pangani Basin. Makanya catchment have a number of irrigation infrastructure that farmers have constructed over a long period of time. You can see from this left-hand picture is that you see a group of irrigation canals with blue dots indicating storage dams, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see another group of irrigation canals with blue dots indicating storage. Now, at the village level, allocation is first agreed on the basis of a tributary. So one group take water at distributary, another group take water from distributary. Now, when that is done within the irrigation canals that are taking water from one tributary, allocation is based on a rotational basis. Now, you'll find that the command area is sometimes used to determine the number of days the irrigation canal takes water. And then in this case, you'll find that the irrigation canals with the biggest area, maybe even 5 days of allocation, while irrigation canal with the smallest area is given 2 days of allocation. But in another system, allocation is maybe based on 4 days allocation system. Here, meaning that the first canal will take water for 4 days, another one will take it for 3 days in one particular week. In the subsequent week, this is rotated so that the first canal now will take it for 3 days and the second canal will take it for 4 days. This system is a flexible practice that allows local community to adapt to a changing context, especially when there is drought-induced scarcity. But it's also unlike the volumetric allocation, customary tenure is about building good relations either within the canal, between canals, or within the village.
Good. Thanks for that, Hans. Sharing the example of customary tenure as it exists in Tanzania, related specifically to irrigation. So what I'd like to now do is to ask the panelists to all come up, if possible. We've got Jessica, Jennifer, if you can all come up, please. And then if we could please move to the Zoom screen and get our virtual panelists also on the screen. There they are. Hi. There we go. Barbara. Hi, Barbara. Hi, Hans. Could we get Aileen spotlighted too, please, pinned? There we go. Aha. There we go. So now we've got our virtual and our in-person panelists. And please keep your questions ready, folks, both in person and online. Barbara, I'm not sure if anybody's bringing in questions in the chat, but participants joining online, please do share your questions in the chat box and we'll bring it into the discussion. I'd like to start, I'll start the ball rolling and then everyone can follow. I'd like to start with Jessica, please, because you didn't present. Now, Jessica, you're an experienced environmental lawyer. You've co-authored that report that was showcased, was it 1 or 2 World Water Weeks ago? Yes, the Whose Water report. Where you analyze formal recognition of customary water tenure in legislation, including water laws, forest laws, environmental laws. Can you maybe comment on what you've heard so far in your experience as a legal practitioner, let's say?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Inga, and thank you to all of the speakers. It's a really compelling and diverse number of presentations. As Inga noted, in 2020, the Environmental Law Institute and our partner, the Rights and Resources Initiative, published an analysis of the legal recognition and protections of the water tenure rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities across 15 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And what I'm really hearing today really resonates with the findings of this study and suggests that water tenure can really provide a meaningful framework for a better understanding and identifying the necessary tools, which we've heard some today, to address the critical challenges of improving equity and distributive justice in water allocation and in realizing the human rights to water and food. We've talked about water tenure a lot, but we haven't defined it yet. So I thought I'd throw out a definition that we're working on with the FAO here. Water tenure is broadly defined as the relationships, whether legally or customarily defined, between individuals and groups with respect to water resources. So water tenure arrangements define who has rights to access, use, and impact water resources, where, for how long, and how those different rights holders relate to one another and to the resource. We're just starting to unpack, as Yipa noted with the NOWAT work and the study that we've done, the diversity, the sheer diversity of water tenure arrangements that derive both from legislative and customary frameworks, and in particular, how those arrangements relate to land and other resource tenure systems. But I think the presenters have really highlighted some of the critical gaps that we're seeing in national water tenure governance that undermine the equitable allocation of water, as well as the resource tenure security of the most vulnerable. But we've also heard about a number of tools. So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to kind of highlight what I think are some of the key issues that we're going to want to explore further, hopefully in the context of this fabulous global consultative process on water tenure. I think first we've heard a number of tools and the importance really of tailoring the legal and administrative frameworks, and not just again in the water sector, but across the water, land, forestry sectors, to the needs of vulnerable users. As Barbara Schreiner highlighted, there's a critical need for innovative solutions to the gaps that we have left by our compulsory permitting systems. Our analysis of community-based water tenure systems reinforces this. We found that across the 15 countries, while most exempt domestic uses from permitting requirements, communities are frequently required to obtain a permit or fulfill another administrative requirement, like form a water user association, before they can have legally protected water rights to use for livelihoods. Even where livelihoods uses are sometimes also exempted from permitting, those use rights often don't have the same legal status as permitted rights. And so they're much more vulnerable to third-party challenges. Given these challenges, and those highlighted by Barbara, there's a really strong need to rethink the legal tools that are available for meeting the policy goals of permitting systems, which are important, but also reducing the burdens and strengthening water tenure security of communities and vulnerable populations. I think it's really exciting what's happening in South Africa too, and we heard about the emphasis on another legal tool, prioritization of both vulnerable users but also their uses. And we see that in a number of different countries, but we rarely see it operationalized effectively. And so it's exciting to see how South Africa is sort of on the vanguard of saying, let's look at our existing legal frameworks and see how we can actually implement and enforce this prioritization and make it meaningful. And I think these are the kinds of things we really need to be taking and seeing how we can adapt to different political, legal, economic, and environmental contexts as we look for tools to strengthen water tenure of the most vulnerable. Hans highlighted the critical role of customary water right systems. These are employed by, so many communities around the world, and they may or may not be legally recognized by countries. The customary practices he described are tailored to local needs and are adaptive to changing conditions and climate, and responsive to both water management and, as he mentioned, sociocultural concerns. This kind of living customary law often operates in tandem with, but is also impacted by legislative water tenure arrangements, and we need to unpack these. So I'm happy to say, we'll hear about this in a minute too, but ELI and IMI are sharing a new publication that looks specifically at the legislative pathways for recognizing customary water tenure in sub-Saharan Africa. But I wanted to point out that the tools for legal recognition are just one step, an important one, but we also have to take into consideration the various ways in which the legal recognition of customary water tenure rights can actually change the very nature of those water tenure systems. And it raises important questions around who has the legitimate authority to determine which customary practices are actually recognized and how, and also about the rights of all members of communities, ensuring that the human rights are recognized and protected in a non-discriminatory manner. Another critical issue that was kind of hinted at here, but I think is absolutely fundamental for water tenure, is the nexus between water, land, and other resource tenure rights. A key finding in our assessment, Whose Water, that report, was that communities' freshwater rights are legally dependent on their recognized land or forest rights in over 60% of the cases that we looked at across 15 countries. And in some cases, this land-water nexus, as we call it, serves as the only source of legal water entitlements for communities and indigenous peoples. So this is really significant, and for a number of reasons. First, we also found that those tenure regimes that rely on land laws or forest laws or constitutions, they provide a more consistent recognition of a wider range of community-based freshwater rights. So rights to use, rights to exclude others, rights to due process, rights to manage their own water resources, than those that are only based in water law. So for many indigenous and local communities, the ability to realize a full suite of water tenure rights, is impossible if their land and forest rights are not also legally recognized and secure. And I think this points to those critical linkages between the VGGT, the voluntary guidelines, and this process discussing the good governance of water tenure. Second, as I noted, this nexus really comes from a number of different places, all these different laws, and yet they rarely speak to each other, not surprising. But it's a fact. And in a lot of cases, they actually contradict one another. So we found that land laws frequently mention water only implicitly as part of a wider set of resources, and water laws are really falling behind. They don't explicitly mention community-based and indigenous water rights very much of the time at the national level. So even where we have a land-water nexus that could provide this important additional avenue for recognition of communities' rights and customary rights, we also need to really focus on the contradictions or lack of clarity between sectoral laws and ensure better harmonization across sectors, not to undermine that water tenure. But we also need to get water laws up to speed when it comes to water tenure, and particularly in community-based and customary.
Can I ask a question, Jessica? So are you saying that land laws, forestry laws, other environmental laws are more progressive in acknowledging customary water tenure than our water laws?
Yeah, but I would caveat that a little bit by saying it's often not explicit. It's often, it's in the context of broader recognition of a set of resource rights within a socio-territorial region for a certain community, where you can infer the legal protections over the water. One really good example, though, is actually Kenya. The Kenyan constitution defines land as including the water that runs on and underneath the land. And then their Community Land Act vests community land rights in their communities without having any kind of procedural requirements at all. Yet the Water Act doesn't recognize that. So I've been in discussions with some of the administrators, and they aren't even sure what to do. They don't know, do we need to permit these communities, or do they automatically get rights to the resources because of the constitutional definition? So these are the kind of things that come out. I have one more point, and then I'll stop talking, I promise. I just wanted to come back to Jennifer's point, and coming from the recent Women in Water Diplomacy Network meeting. There's a critical need to ensure consideration of women's specific water tenure rights. And what we found is this is a really huge legal gap. In our assessment, Whose Water, we found that women's rights to take part in planning, decision-making, and conflict resolution around water are almost never considered in national laws. And we only found one water law, really, where we found some good provisions. And this is critical, as globally less than 15% of landholders are women, and women own a significantly smaller share of land than men. So we have to focus both on strengthening women's land and forest rights, but also really looking at how we can strengthen water laws to explicitly recognize women's water tenure rights. So those variety of challenges, but we've also heard about these great tools, this prioritization, the idea of having hybrid water laws that exempt categories of communities from permitting requirements. Really come back to this need for a global policy discussion to build consensus around the need for distributive water justice as a fundamental underlying principle of water tenure, and the role of water tenure governance in supporting the realization of poverty alleviation and the human rights to food and water. So I'm super excited that we have this unique and timely opportunity to participate in this FAO-supported global process. And I really hope that it'll offer us a multi-stakeholder forum for coming to better consensus around these principles and lead us to a more just water world. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Jessica. Thank you very much for that, Jessica. And really important, you also raised this issue of when we're talking about customary water tenure and the bottom-up process, which organizations, which actors are we bringing into the room with us? Who is advocating for whose rights here? I think that's an important point. So let me open up the discussion to the floor, both in person and virtually. I see a hand at the back. So could we get the colleague a microphone? And then, Barbara, you've got some questions from the online as well. So we'll take the in-person comments at the back first, and then we'll move to some. Anybody else? Please just raise your hand. Okay, all right. Now we're getting alive. All right, good. Thank you. Please introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Neil Lazaro is my name, from the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. I have two interrelated questions. So the first one is to a colleague from FAO. So you talked a little bit about water accounting, and you said you need to measure. And I just wonder how you go about doing that, where there's incredible disagreement about how much water there is in particular groundwater sources, and actually wonder whether bringing in a, I don't know, like a Western water accounting system might actually complicate matters and make things worse, because you move the conversation from one around governance and customary systems to one around a technical solution. So I don't know the answer, so I'm asking the question. The second one relates to everyone in the panel, how well you think customary tenure is likely to stand up under the influence of climate impacts, where there's maybe will be less water or water at the wrong time of the year to support irrigation and cropping, etc. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Neil. We'll take a few questions if that's okay. So we've noted your two questions. First one specifically for Yip, the second one for anyone on the panel. But let's move to the two. There were two hands I saw. Yes, in the middle, and then over there. Okay, there's three hands now. Good.
Am I to go next? Okay, yeah, Andy Roby. I'm from the UK government, the Foreign Office, lead on water policy in the Climate Directorate. And yeah, really interesting this work is going on. I've been a backseat supporter, I'm afraid, until hopefully now. And with the consultation coming up, I wish it wasn't during COP27. Because I'm going to be busy, I think, with Egypt and water and all the rest of it. But that aside, we launched at COP26 this Fair Water Footprint partnership, which is bringing business into this question of what is fair. And when you're a food company, and you're importing food with a footprint, is it fair that that's coming from land where water rights are not established? And I wondered if you had thought about this. Barbara knows all about it. I can see you grinning. It's great to see you, Barbara. But yeah, because you're part of this great partnership of 28 countries and businesses and other organizations, trying to work out what this looks like for a business, trying to do a responsible, ethical thing of sourcing their food and drink and textiles and critical minerals from places where water rights are well established and fair. So there we go. Business question. Oh, and related to that, Yip, the FGGT standards, guidelines on, which include a word on water, as far as I'm concerned, and not much else. I don't think we should put up with them anymore. I think they should be rapidly revised. That's not a view held across the FCDO, I can tell you, but I think they're rather weak, and we could do a lot better than that. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sandy. I mean, questions on business, but also ethics, I think. Good, very good question. Okay, we've got the third question, and then there was one more. Then let's allow some responses, Barbara, if that's okay, and we'll bring in the online in a second round. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Nolwandle Mate. I am from South Africa. I'm wearing different hats. But the hat that I want to ask this is I work for social justice at Stellenbosch University. And part of the work we're doing is trying to bring the equity duty into administrative law, which is, I think, what is happening here. And actually, we had a customary law roundtable last year, if I'm not mistaken, and I would have loved to have this. It was mostly on land, but because we really, you spoke of the land and water nexus, we can't separate the two, but we did. But my main concern is when it comes to customary law, it is it is very, there are, although in South Africa especially, there's been rulings by the Constitutional Court on the rights of women when it comes to customary law. And I like this idea of customary. You spoke of customary groups having water rights. It makes sense. It actually, it's common sense. Some of these things are common sense. It is common sense, and we tend to sometimes forget common sense, or maybe it's not common to everyone. But I want us, when we look at this, and it was mentioned that the rights of women, especially rights of rural women, and even more especially when we talk social justice, we look at those people who, if any law, because what you're proposing has good intentions, but good intentions sometimes unduly harm certain groups, and we don't want to harm women and rural women who has the voice, who has the rights, and I want that, just to keep that in mind, that when we tailor things for everyone, they really have to be tailored for everyone.
Excellent question, Ms. Bate. You know, interestingly, it was last year's World Water Week session where I think, Barbara, you made the comment that, you know, we shouldn't romanticize statutory water law, and we shouldn't also romanticize customary water tenure. And that sort of stuck with me as well all these months. So yeah, thank you for that. There was one last hand, and then I'm going to ask for a round of responses from the panel, and then we'll go to a second round if that's okay. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for that. That was super interesting. My name is Melanie Rideout. I work for LM International, leading on our climate resilience work. You haven't mentioned it, but the ecocide law, how does that interact with the water tenure that you're proposing? Also when looking at harmonization and also overall strengthening of environmental law, and making sure that environmental law does actually work for those of the most marginalized and vulnerable groups. And also including youth within this. So I'm actually part of the Youth for Ecocide Law group. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. So now we have the challenges and opportunities with women as well as with youth. But let me see who wants to go first on the panel. Jennifer here, and then the virtual participants. I see Barbara's. Okay, so let's go Jennifer and then Barbara, and then we can go around.
Some of the questions that have been raised are interlinked, but I think the one thing that we really have to realize is that there needs to be ethics, there needs to be responsibility. The reason why this is becoming such a big and a hot topic is that for days on end, we keep allocating rights for use in industry and everywhere else because we are assuming that there is available water. And it is in fact at the expense of people whose rights of water are not being recognized. And I think this is the linkage that you're talking about when you're saying some of these things should be common sense, but we are not applying it because it's not explicit, it is implied. And so communities are not the wiser, they don't know much more, and therefore they do not also see and utilize and exercise this right. But I think one of the critical things that was raised was that in terms of value that these rights hold, can you imagine what rights hold? I mean, your title deed, if you go to the bank, if you go wherever. But this also discriminates people because they do not have that, and therefore it's important that we start working practically around how to ensure that the rights, I mean, the tenure rights are actually realized. Most importantly, and I think in our discussion last night, we talked about what do people know as value. You don't need to give them a right or a title deed or a permit, something that they must see. It is their experience that they must actually realize that there is value. And what is that value? It's in South Africa, for example, in the rural areas, which is held in trust on behalf of the people by the chiefs. they give you a right to occupy, for example, land. And with that right to occupy land is the mostly prized thing that any household would have, and it will be taken from generation to generation because nobody can move you. So we do not necessarily have to create other different instruments. It's to try and say, when it comes with that, and therefore this is the value of the water that comes with it. But then we need to go a step further and educate the authorities across the length and breadth in terms of what is that meaning. Our commercial institutions such as banks, the value that comes with it, it must be the same for what a farmer has when they have got a water use license similar to what we would have. So practicality means, I think for me, it's around educating not only the people and overburdening them with this thing that it's not going to be used for anything, because you go to the commercial and to try and access the markets or money, and you can't do that because it's not worth the paper it's written on. But also in terms of the policy implementers and regulators, when we recalculate the balance, the water balances, to say how much water is available, we should also be deducting that water. That is a very important aspect. And this will definitely push industries and commercial and corporates to start using water responsibly, to start looking at innovative and technological advances to be efficient in their use of water. But at a higher level, we can also make them accountable in that, what is your water footprint, as we are now looking at this carbon footprints, and for statutory as well as for accountability purposes and credibility. And then we will be able to close that loop and make sure that this is not just a talk show, but this is something that actually is meaningful and an experience that will be different from the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. You said something, and it also links to our colleague from Stellenbosch, you know, this where water is, say, managed by a tribal authority. We know the issues there around women's limited access to those rights. By sort of acknowledging customary tenure in that way, are we not, you know, indirectly entrenching those gender inequalities? Just putting it out. Just putting it out there. Let's go to Barbara, and then we can take some other responses. Barbara, over to you.
Thanks, Inga, and thanks for the interesting questions. I mean, the first question was around how well customary law or customary practices are going to respond to climate change. And let me rephrase the question: how will any of us respond to climate change? It's coming down the road at us apparently a hell of a lot faster than we thought it was going to come down the road. But you know, I think there are 2 points about my very limited understanding of customary law. The one is that it's basically fairly adaptive. It's based on local conditions and quite adaptive. And the second is that it has built-in dispute resolution mechanisms. And I think in that regard, there will be the possibility to adapt quite well to climate change. One might ask whether the statutory systems that we have, where things are written down on paper, you're entitled to X amount, you're entitled to Y amount, will be as adaptable in the face of climate change, and how we're going to need to change permit systems to actually be able to cope better with climate change. And that links to the whole question that Andy raised around the fair water footprints and the whole business. So what does this mean for business? And I think it's very interesting, because I think one of the things is that the corporate world needs to understand the context, that in developing countries, not all water use is captured on paper, not all water use is registered. A lot of water use is not sort of captured and recognized in that way at all. And if they are coming in with a genuine commitment to stewardship, to fairness, that they need to recognize that, and they need to take the extra step of actually understanding what the customary use is in the catchment, and how to protect it and how to work with those communities. The Fair Water Footprints process is actually at the moment trying to develop a white paper around what is meant by equitable, because it's one of those words that everybody in the water sector uses. Oh, more equitable. Oh, equitable water use. None of us have actually defined what it means. And so in the Fair Water Footprint process, we are trying to say, in this process, in the Fair Water Footprint process, this is what is meant by equitable. And Andy, it's a timely reminder. I still need to read the draft and comment on it. And I will in the process make sure that this whole issue of customary water use is actually dealt with. And then one last very quick comment, because I don't want to take up too much time at Memate. I'm very interested in the process that you have looking at administrative law and equity. Obviously, we have the notion of customary law and statutory law, but in the South African context, we also have an overriding piece of legislation, which is the Constitution. And any form of law actually needs to abide by the principles of the Constitution, one of which is no discrimination on the grounds of gender and all of other things. And the question then is, how do you ensure that both the statutory law and the customary law actually fall under those principles of the Constitution? Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Barbara. Does anybody want to respond to some of the other questions? Yep, there was a question directly about whether water accounting is at odds with decolonization and customary water tenure. I've paraphrased, sorry, Neil. But did you want to maybe respond to that?
Yes, yeah. Well, I think I should know.
Yes,
yes.
Obligated
yeah. Well. What we promote is indeed that water accounting and water governance assessments, they go hand in hand. Yeah. So I think you should not do one without the other. For example, when you do water accounting without a water governance assessment, you may be very well aware of how the hydrological cycle is, but if you do not, but that still does not give if that information does not get to the policymakers and will be turned into proper plans to manage the water, it will not. It's not useful. But the other way around is even worse. I would say that you come up with legislation without knowing how much water there is. Then in that sense you could give away too much water. So in that sense I think that everything should go hand in hand, and we do not think that it have to be very advanced methodologies. That it can be. We also promote innovative technological solutions, like for example using remote sensing and assessing how much water is there and how much water is evaporating, and how much biomass is coming from this evapotranspiration. But we also promote other solutions that are much easier for water users associations, for example, to measure groundwater levels, and on the basis of the groundwater levels sit together as water users and come up with a plan on which crop should be grown and which area should be irrigated. So what we think should go hand in hand, and we do not believe only you should not look at in isolation, both parts of the coin.
Good. So sort of co-management approaches. Great. Okay.
Inga, one of the questions that was asked was around climate change. In fact, when we do not recognize customary water tenure, the people that are particularly women and youth and in the rural areas, and historically that were obviously discriminated for whatever reason, they will be even worse off. Because as we are counting for the water and saying this is where we need to make plans, we are not counting those people because they are not there in the numbers. They are not there as part of the administration and the database that we have to say, this is where you need to. So where you've got areas that undergo disasters and all of that, you are always looking at, and I mean, in our country, it's actually very prevalent where it's always about the farmers, or it's always about the industries that have lost, but it's less talk about the people that have been affected because they don't count. And therefore this then makes them part of the equation when we enumerate and we calculate and say what is available and what needs to go where, we're also enumerating them. And that's very important, I think.
Thanks. Thanks, Jennifer. Cheers.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for that, Jennifer, because I was actually, the thing that keeps coming up in answer to all of these questions, or at least in partial answer, is the critical role of due process and inclusiveness in procedural mechanisms for ensuring that people are at the table, that they have the capacity to be at the table, that they're included in meaningful ways. I mean, in terms of women's water inclusion, clearly, the process has to be inclusive, or else we don't get women's perspective. And when it comes to looking at things like recognizing customary law, that's going to be fundamentally critical, because we have to think about how do we then, ensure non-discrimination. I think, You know, some other tools are also related to the land-water nexus and the fact that you can't look at those questions in isolation. You also have to look at inheritance laws, you have to look at marriage laws, you have to look at land tenure, and make sure that all of those things are part of the accounting for how we're going to have realistic non-discrimination in water tenure for women. But coming back to the due process, and by that I mean, you know, giving people access to information, having them have meaningful opportunities for participating in decision making, and then having a right to redress if their rights are threatened in any way, that they can go to a local, you know, either the customary tribunal, or they can go to courts if they need to, you know, in order to enforce those things. And I think, you know, one thing that came to mind when you were talking about the sort of the business case for this is that is a huge area where business can do better. You know, and I've seen, you know, really great strides in terms of, you know, certain, you know, agricultural initiatives across different industries, the palm oil industry and others, trying to say, you know, we support FPIC, we support free, prior, and informed consent with the communities, and that has to be clearly linked to water rights and water tenure rights. You know, but I think no matter what we talk about, you know, we really need to bring it back to the fundamental procedural safeguards of making sure that these processes are all inclusive and participatory. Thank you.
Great. Great. Thanks, Jessica. I want us to go back to the floor. There were 1 or 2 questions here, and then there were also a few online. So could we just get the mic to Barbara in the front? She's going to read out a few of the online questions, and then we'll take there's 2 questions in the room.
Thanks very much. I'm Barbara van Koppen with International Water Management Institute as well. And having here a question that was already alluded to from Madeleine Keizer. Given the increasing role of corporations in financing and influencing global water policy, how to ensure that nature and communities have a meaningful voice? Aren't corporate-led strategies, if unintentionally, undermining water equity? So how to create monitoring processes in basins where corporations, under the banner of public-private partnerships, nature-based solutions, private financing, are moving into roles once inhabited by the public sector. And I think this also alludes to the presentation yesterday by Joyita Gupta. Very much. Can I answer it? Thank you.
She's got a burning desire to answer that question. Go for it, Barbara.
Because it was already alluded to. I think the due process and the example of, if I also can cite the example in South Africa, where as a moment it is a constitutional court case, that the organized white farmers who use most of the water historically after expropriating the land and the water, the question, what does it mean if the state, as Madeleine also said, the role of the state and the state as custodian of the natural water resources? The infrastructure is a different thing, yes, domestic supplies, municipalities, but the water resources that flow into the infrastructure, who owns that natural resource? And with anti-apartheid, the new government said the government is custodian of the water resources. The white farmers now say, but I want to trade, so the transferability of a use right. So at independence, you have to change your legal system. So temporarily, and Barbara Schreiner was part of it, temporarily you say, oh, okay, we acknowledge existing lawful uses that were lawful under the apartheid, but gradually we all go to licenses. Licenses are not tradable. Licenses are use rights with conditions, waste, etc. So the question is now in the Constitutional Court, can I say as a white farmer, this is my property, and if I give it up, I get money for it. In the end, it is about the monetary value, the scarcity value that they created of water. But we hope, let's see what comes out. The government is clearly saying, use it or lose it. If you don't need the water and you can trade it off, or if you sell your farm and etc., then it goes back to the pool. Related to that, and then is the mixing up between the billing and the entitlement. So again, unpacking the bundle of rights, as you say, Jessica, there are a lot of aspects of the rights. And of course, the new government needed to continue billing the existing users, industrial white farmers. So there is a system, then administrative system, to bill. And now the discussion is, yeah, but of course you have to bill, but that doesn't mean that you have to pay your invoices for water resource management, but it doesn't mean that you also have the entitlement to call it private property. And lastly, and then I stop, the importance of prioritization, is that you don't need to know exactly how much water you have. Because it is a matter of comparing, like pairwise ranking. Well, this is more important than that. This poverty eradication, yes, is more important than, again, and Madeleine also, an outside foreign corporate investor who then wants to invest. By the way, the investor, if the state, the whole of the state is custodian of water resources, it's impossible that investors come in and just say, no, government, we want your water. Everybody, foreign and national, should abide to the, in the case of new water uptake, it's quite straightforward. You have to plan it. And as you say, the burden of proof, who has to show now that my new dam, whatever, is not going to negatively impacting on Mrs. Mkwasi, who needs water for 2 hectares to feed. The burden of proof that there won't be any impact is then with the new license applicant. The few big users who are really going to have an impact, they have to show that the higher priorities, that everybody agrees about really, that they are not affected. The big question is then how to, for historical justice, how to make sure that all the water entitlements that were already appropriated are slowly getting a lower assurance of supply. It is all variable, so lower assurance of supply is also a way to manage. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. The interesting thing, was it Madeleine's question? The interesting thing that I felt from her question was also when she said how to ensure that people and nature have an equal voice. What happens when nature and people are at odds? Right? Water for the environment, for the Kruger versus water for the informal settlements, you know, a little bit upstream.
Yeah. Some people call it green apartheid. The fact that the downstream Kruger Park can claim pristine flows like 7,000 years ago, for the tourist, the elite tourist, while the people who have been pushed out of the land, all in the fringes then of the former homelands, don't even have water for domestic uses, but now have to compete with the Kruger Park, who can easily build their own dams for the tourists and for the lions.
Okay, yeah, very bold statements there. Barbara van Koppen, everybody. Let's go to, and unfortunately we're going to, this is interesting, we could spend hours. Okay, but so we'll take 2 more, and then I want to hear from Hans and Aline as well, who haven't responded. So let's take these 2 questions in the room. Barbara, I'm not sure if there's anything online anymore, but okay, we'll go here. Oh, yes, please go.
Thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Gilana Simpiwe from the Department of Water and Sanitation in South Africa. My issue now, I'm trying to advocate for women, but the more we advocate for women's rights, the more they are at a disadvantage. I'll tell you why. There was a 3,000 hectares of water that has been set aside by the former minister, Professor Kada Asmal, for support of the emerging farmers. But when that water was issued, women were also given those water rights for irrigation purposes. But they are unable to use that water because they don't have access for infrastructure. And those that are male people that have gained access to that water, they are able to partner with the white commercial farmers, and they are exporting as we speak across the globe. Those women were given land rights from the municipality, and that water rights has since expired, the lease agreement, and now they don't have access to water, they don't have access to land. So how can we address those kind of issues? But another issue that I came up having a question on is how can we balance the issue of equitable allocation of water, sustainability, and this issue of economic efficiency, because we know, and it's been stated everywhere else, that water has to be paid for because we want to gain or to provide for the development of infrastructure and maintenance of infrastructure. But how do you balance equity versus economic efficiency and sustainability at the same time? Because to me, they seem to be contradicting to each other. If you address equity, surely economic efficiency will be at a disadvantage. If you focus on economic efficiency, equitable allocation will be at a disadvantage. So I've been always looking at an article or a book that will be able to answer this question of how can we balance these three issues. Because yesterday I was making a presentation on pricing of water in agriculture, and this is the issue. And I'm also looking at how can we then have a policy that would look at a public-private partnerships, because those that were able to form partnerships with white commercial farmers, they are exporting now, and they are very young, male-dominated. But the women, they are excluded. And as we speak now, they are not in farming, they don't have access to water, and that water has been, that land and water has been taken away because they can't have access, they don't have the voice to speak for themselves as women. So I'm looking at how can we address this issue of women, because as the policies are there, but on the ground is a different story. And we are also, as the policymakers and other people, looking at the SDGs to address these issues. But at this level, we're talking about SDGs, but at the lower level, we are far. Thanks.
Thank you, Simpiwe. That's great, and we'll ask the panelists to weigh in. We've got 4 minutes, folks, so we're going to have to wrap up soon. So please keep your question really brief, and then I will ask some short responses from the panel, starting with Hans and Eileen.
Thank you. My name is Maria Angele, and I'm Senior Water Advisor at United Nations Development Program, UNDP. So thank you. I was very intrigued by the presentation from Pagani, the conclusion where the customary rights is more about relations than water quantities. So I would be happy to hear some more about that. And that makes me think about when I've been listening in to several consultations with indigenous peoples on water. And what strikes me there, that maybe more a discussion about rights, there is a discussion about obligations and responsibilities towards water. And so I wonder, now in the consultation on water tenure, what is the potential to marry water rights and responsibilities together, in a sense, to have them come together, and hopefully, and I think it maybe goes to many other actors, to increase the sense of responsibility that's also been alluded to here in relation to the water rights or entitlements. So,
yeah, really great question. Thank you very much for that. Maybe let's start with Hans, if you can continue on the Pangani.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a good question, and my emphasis there was on relations, other than trying emphasizing more on the water itself, because in most cases these communities have been together for a long time, and there's a lot of network between them. So for part of that principle, or the process that they use for allocation of water, is about recognizing that they are dependent on one another. So there is a long interdependencies between the communities that are there. So of course, when we are talking about other forms of water tenure, sometimes these critical elements are not taken into account. It is strongly linked with the economic aspect of water, as the previous speaker also mentioned on the question about equity, economics, and sustainability. The emphasis has been so much about recovery, cost recovery, and sometimes this cost recovery is put in a way that there is not a particular infrastructure that are in place. For most of the community, these processes are built around what we call hydraulic property right creation. So there is an investment that people make, and in that process, the water that is captured is treated as a resource that they could share, but while recognizing the connections and the relations between them. So I would say that this is an element that if you go around Pangani and you try to talk about farmers and see what structures they have developed, that this always come back. And even when you do mapping around, you will still find relations as a main binding components in trying to share water. So I think in marrying the two, water, more formal and customary water tenure, there is a need to look at relations as a key component. I think there was some other question around that has been answered, but I think I will leave the issues of multiple use to Aline. But I guess there's a new dimension.
You're going to have to wrap up. Sorry, we're running out of time. So if you, 2 seconds, 3 seconds.
2 seconds, good. I just wanted to say that there is a emerging component of like new farmers that are coming in. And sometimes these are also coming in with the youth. And I think in that case, there is issues of customary or living customary tenure that are linked. I would call this as farmer-led irrigation initiative areas. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hans. Aileen, you've been quiet. Any final words? You've got 10 seconds.
Okay. Thank you very much for everything. So for my 10 seconds, I would say we have to have a holistic view of the system. So we need to understand the biophysical system and the water counting, understanding the hydrology is very important for that. But we also need to understand the other systems that are in place in the catchments. So the other organizations, the way to empower women, we need to focus on capacity building at the ground level, at grassroots level. And that's the way that we can really bring them to the table, that we can also make their needs heard. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Aileen. Folks, we've spoken about so many things, but please just give this panel a round of applause. We do have to wrap up. Thank you so much, everybody. We know that FAO, in partnership with others, will take things forward through the global dialogue process. We will continue to work on the ground with colleagues in Tanzania, in the Inkomati, in South Africa, to really work in partnership with community organizations, but the issues of capacity, due process, but also co-management approaches, bringing in water accounting as well as issues around tenure are so important. So thank you so much to you all. I'm going to ask our DDG, Rachel Donald, just to say, you've got 1 minute. In fact, you've probably got a -1 minute. Thank you, colleagues, for bearing with us. Rachel will just wrap it up and conclude for us. Could we please put the last slide on the screen?
So thank you, Inga. Just as I'm living on borrowed time here, too many of our river basins are living on borrowed time if we don't sort out laws and rights and allocations. Too many of our river basins are over-allocated, and there are so many layers of rights, so many layers of that management. So what we have heard today are examples of what we're trying to do in terms of a hybrid water law, where we can take the national statutory systems and embed customary water law. What we hear is also, just even when you've got a law, how difficult it is to implement. There are too many unintended consequences, as you said, sir. But there's also, we just can't enforce it. How many legal institutions, regulatory water institutions have enough people to go out and measure and to actually make it happen, even when Barbara and Jessica and everybody has worked on bringing them up? So at EMI, this is a very important area for us. We bridge water and agriculture and energy. And this is some of where these tensions are already playing out. They're going to Supreme Court justices are already being asked to make decisions based on this. We need so much more insight. We see this great work coming out of South Africa. Yippee, you're taking it forward to 3 more countries, but we need to take this through many more. We welcome you looking at these 2 newly launched reports. They've just got onto our website yesterday, I think, that really gives some more insight. One co-led by Jessica and the other one with Barbara here, which will give insight. So let's keep talking about this over tea, over coffee, and bring that into all our conversations over the next 2 days, because governance, policies, rights are fundamental within any water discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, everybody.